everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to talk to you about all of the books that I read in October. Well, actually, I'm going to talk to you about half of the books that I read in October. I read 15 books in total, and I actually have 16 to talk to you about because there's one that I forgot to wrap up the previous month for some reason. I should have done a mid-month wrap-up, but I just didn't have the foresight to do that. So I'm going to split them by talking to you about the adult books in this video. So adult fiction, non-fiction and poetry. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about the children's books and YA that I read in October. Victober was also a thing that happened, and it went relatively unsuccessfully. The main book I was planning on tackling in Victober was Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, but I'm only 200 pages into it, so I will tell you about this one when I eventually finish it. There was only one other book that I finished for Victober, and you can hear me talk about that in the second part of the wrap-up. I'm going to start with the two adult non-fiction books I have, because the first one of those is the one that I forgot to wrap up last month, and that is Odd Girl Out by Laura James. This is about a woman who was diagnosed with autism when she was in her 40s. It looks at her experience of that diagnosis, potential signs there were throughout her life that she should have been diagnosed with autism, how her life has changed post-diagnosis. It just basically takes a look at some ways that autistic people tend to think and process things differently to how neurotypical people do. I think when we imagine someone with autism, we tend to think about like young boys, not grown women, for example. And in fact, one of the reasons that so many women get into adulthood without a diagnosis is because a lot of traits that are associated with autism aren't seen as unusual in girls in the same way they are with boys. And that's something that this book really deals with. It also deals with some really interesting things surrounding Brexit and autism, and how the way Laura James thinks made it such a clear-cut decision for her that Brexit was a bad idea, and also the idea of that amount of change made her feel incredibly anxious and stressed. So that was something that I hadn't really thought about before, and there's a lot of stuff in this that I wasn't really aware of, and it was a great way to get an insight into how people think differently. I will say parts of this book feel a little rushed, can be a little bit repetitive, but I did learn so much from this book, and if it's something that you think you would benefit from learning about as well, I would really highly recommend it. The next non-fiction book I read was Raising the Dead by Andy Dugan, and I read this kind of adjacently to Victober because it is meant to be a book about experiments that happened in the early 1800s in Glasgow that involved using electrical stimulation to raise the dead in a way that is quite similar to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Kind of tells you that this book is going to be about things that may have inspired Mary Shelley. Like, it's just not that. Like, there are some elements you can see similarities between, but the way the book is presented makes me think like the majority of the book is going to be comparing these experiments to Frankenstein. And really this book is much more about how electricity impacted the medical profession. The book meanders and goes off in tangents, and I think the author really struggles to stay on topic. If you're someone that wants to learn more about the impact of electricity in medical science, this is a great book. If you are someone who goes into this book like I did, wanting to see the similarities between these experiments and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you will be left very disappointed. I did learn a lot from this book, and there were a lot of interesting things in it, but I think putting on the front cover the men who created Frankenstein is very misleading. Now onto the fiction. The first fiction book I'm going to tell you guys about is Eat My Heart Out by Zoe Pilger. I really don't know how I feel about this novel, and having read some other reviews about it, that seems to be the general consensus. This is a satirical novel about a 23-year-old woman who has terrible mental health. She's not in a good living situation. She's in one of these like living situations where people think they're living a really like bohemian lifestyle when really they're just living somewhere awful. She puts herself in really horrible sexual situations. She treats people and herself horribly. This book is supposedly really funny and satirical and like is meant to kind of take the piss out of people who live those kinds of lifestyles. But I found it irritating more so than funny. Like, the protagonist mentions constantly that she's in Clapham, and I live like 20 minutes from Clapham. It's really nice, but it's not worth mentioning like every other page. And I think that's maybe like one of the points that the author is trying to make. Like, this character is constantly going on about like her London lifestyle. I was quite disappointed in this one, and it was one of those books that was a real cover buy for me. And I think if I'd read some reviews before I bought it, then I probably wouldn't have picked it up. Another book that I was unfortunately left quite disappointed by was Leanne Moriarty's Truly Madly Guilty. I've read 2 of her other books. I read The Husband's Secret and Big Little Lies, the latter of which I think she's most well known for because I think it is her best book. This is similar in setup to other Leanne Moriarty books in that it involves quite a lot of privileged people and the lead up to an event where something dramatic and scandalous and dangerous and tragic happens. The timeline jumps around, so you are seeing both the lead up to what happens and the aftermath simultaneously. I found the climax of this novel a real letdown. I mean, it's a terrible thing that happens, but I did just expect it to be more. If any of you have read this book, I would love to have a chat about it down in the comments, because I don't know, was it just me that felt that way? I do think I would give another one of Leanne Moriarty's books a try, but if I find it similarly mediocre, that might be it. I really do feel like Big Little Lies was probably her peak. Next up, I have Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This was originally written in Japanese, and this is the English translation of it. And in many ways, you could view this as a collection of 4 short stories, and you can read it that way. But they are all set in the same place, and that is a small cafe in Tokyo where if you sit in this one particular seat, you can travel back in time. But there are some conditions to this. You can only have conversations with someone who has been in that cafe. Nothing that happens as part of that conversation will impact the future, so you can't like change anything. You can just re-experience things in a different way. And you have to finish your conversation before your coffee gets cold. That is such a charming little idea for a story. Our first story follows someone who would like to confront their lover who has just left them, and I think that's something that we can all definitely imagine ourselves doing. The next story is a very sad one about a woman who would like to receive a letter from her husband who has started to lose his memory. The next follows someone who would like to see their sister for the very last time. And the final story follows someone who would like to meet the daughter that they never got a chance to meet. Each of them are touching in different ways, and this is a really lovely read. It does leave you with that kind of thought experiment of what would you do if you were able to experience something like this. It's a very quiet, charming novel, which is something that I've experienced with a lot of the Japanese translated fiction that I've read. The next novel I have is The Forgotten Waltz by Anne Enright. I am such a big fan of this author, and this book did not disappoint. In many ways, Anne Enright's books are also very quiet. They show the extraordinary drama in everyday events. This isn't a book that has big plot twists, and in many ways it doesn't even really reach a conclusion. It just is. You just have this window into these characters' lives to observe. Dominantly focus on the affair between a man and a woman who are both married, like to different people, obviously, that's why it's an affair. But it's also set to the backdrop of the economic boom and subsequent crash in Ireland. One of the things I really love about Enright's writing is that it doesn't present Ireland as cozy, idyllic countryside. It's much more about the Ireland that I know in Dublin. I think she's just a really intelligent writer, and I really want to read everything that she's written. The final fiction book I have is Expectation by Anna Hope. This is the proof copy. Obviously, the final cover doesn't look like this. This follows the friendship between 3 women who are in different ways jealous of each other. They had a really intense friendship when they were younger, but now that they've got a bit older, their lives haven't panned out exactly how they thought they would. We have one who is struggling to get her career together. She is a struggling actress. One who is a new mother and is really struggling with that. One who is desperate to have a baby but can't. They all have other complications in their lives as well. You know, it's not just that. There are their romantic relationships, their relationships with each other, their relationships with their families. And the book essentially charts the complications of all of those things and how they weave and intersect and how the friendship between these three women is strained. I think it's a really interesting portrayal of that time in women's lives and how you can have all these hopes when you're younger, but they may not necessarily turn out the way you hoped they would. I don't think there's anything groundbreaking or massively nuanced in here, but it is really compelling reading and it does feel very honest. And I think it's a book that doesn't pass judgment either. There is no narrative voice telling you that what a particular character has done here is wrong. It just presents what's happening and it's up to you to react to that in whatever way you see fit. I do think this is really interesting, and as someone who has an idea of what their life might be like when they reach their 30s, it was interesting to think about whether things will actually pan out the way I expect them to. Finally, I have 2 poetry books to talk to you guys about. The first of those is Come Close by Sappho. Sappho was deemed the 10th muse by Plato, and this is her quite romantic verse. I don't think I've ever read any poetry that was this old before, and I really enjoyed it. There is so much sensuality in this poetry, and one of the things that I really appreciated about it was that there were elements of this writing style that Sappho has that I really saw as akin to a lot of contemporary romantic poetry. A lot of poetry that you might see falling into the category of insta poetry. Her use of sound effect and simile and metaphor were things that weren't a million miles away from insta poetry that I'd read. And I really appreciated that because I think not only does it give validity to that style of poetry as a valid art form, but I think it also shows that older poetry is still really accessible. I'm not saying this is like the exact same as Milk and Honey, but I'm saying that they're not as far apart that I think a lot of highbrow types may lead you to believe. And the final book for this half of the wrap-up is The Luckiest Guy Alive by John Cooper Clarke. John Cooper Clarke is one of my favourite poets of all time. He's affectionately deemed the poet laureate of punk, and if you've not read any of his poetry before, I would actually really recommend you going to listen to him perform. Like, just look him up on YouTube and you will find plenty of videos. His poetry features a really intelligent use of repetition and refrain. In many ways it can feel like a guitar riff that is repeated. Some of his poetry does deal with political topics, but he presents them in a very humorous way. The poems in this collection are also far more self-aware than I think any of his poetry that I'd read before. Like, there's a lot of reflection on the aging process, for example. I think he's a really important poet in the history of performance poetry, and if you are someone who is into like slam poetry and that kind of stuff, then I think he's a really important voice to listen to because he's really like the godfather of that in a way. So they are all the adult books that I read in October. Do keep your eyes peeled for the second part of this wrap-up where I'll be talking about the kids and YA books that I read in October. As ever, all of the books I mentioned will be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more about them. And if you've read any of them, do leave a comment down below and we can have a little chat about them. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.